Thank you very much, Asha, for that. Any questions? All right. I think I'll then invite Carlos to talk about community networks and gender. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina, and thank you very much, everyone, for allowing me to speak here. Actually, thank you, Vimala, for actually giving the word to us. It was simply amazing what you said, and I think it's what you are doing, promoting the work of women, is actually fascinating and very necessary. So obviously, I'm one of the Seed Alliance grantees that is not a woman. I receive, together with Altermundi and the organization I work where I used to work, Sense Eleni, an interregional grant for developing the Libre router, which is a piece of technology. We will be presenting it today at 11:40 that allows or facilitates that any community, no matter their technical training, is able to deploy their own telecommunications infrastructure. With regards to community networks and gender, well, community networks at the end of the day is particularly that, no? It's communities or groups of people that are able to set their own communications infrastructure and govern it and control it in any way they consider it meets their own needs, being the type of intrusion that you have all control over the technology, over the prices, over many of these issues. So at the moment, and as part of APC, I started working in APC in August, coordinating a project about a research project also funded by IDRC that is aiming to maybe I speak with that one. No. Cool. A research project that actually is looking at community networks in a broader sense. It looks at 4 activity areas, and in one of the activity areas is actually profile and understand better existing community networks and understand their social impact and their gender component. Something that is very well known is that the community networks movement is considerably male-dominated. Some of the cultural patterns that you have explained with regards to the use of technology and in the communities make that at the end of the day, men are the one behind these projects, no matter how you try to engage with women. And a component of this project is actually exploring 6 of these community networks in a bit more depth to try to understand how women are participating, what are the barriers, what are the opportunities, what are the mechanisms to actually be able to allow that more women participate in these processes according to the culture. I mean, there is, it's not a parachuting project at all, and it's actually working with those brave women that have been able to break the cycle and that are going beyond those challenges that you were describing, Asa, that I've seen by myself in many other rural communities in South Africa where I live. And so trying to understand that and trying to in this first phase, to understand what is happening in community networks and gender, what is preventing women to participate more, what are the mechanisms to facilitate that women participate more. And so I wanted to leave it there, but I also was, I wanted to go back to something that Joanna said about how would it look like if women develop apps, right? And this is how would it look like if women develop telecoms, develop the infrastructure, develop not only the apps, but the technology, the routers, the hardware, not only the software. How would it look like if these community networks are run by women? At the end of the day, in most rural Africa, in most rural places, women are the ones that are living there. Yet, for instance, in the community where I used to live, there were 70% of the population were women. Yet, the community network is run by men. And so how do you actually break those circles? What are the points of entry and around that? And the same with the Libre router, for instance. It was massively designed by men. I had a very interesting conversation with Fernanda from Digital Defenders around, well, how would it look like if more women would have participated on it, right? So I just wanted to go back to one of the, well, I was very lucky to fire, apart from giving you the grant, you are invited to join Afrinic events, and you meet there with the other grantees. And the project that actually that was granted this year, well, together with mine, to AFCHICS, to actually promote and create profiles of women that have succeeded in technology. And I think it's a project that I don't know if you have explored, but I think it's very beautiful, and I think it's creating those roles, that breaking those cycles of women are able to do it, and other women can see themselves. I think it's a very massive step in breaking the confidence and breaking the barriers for more women to feel more confident to participate. But yeah, I think also from a RIR perspective, I think the participation of women in telecoms is not only women in technology. I think women in technology at other levels, there is still a massive gender imbalance, but if you look at at women in telecoms, the imbalance is total, like is brutal. And I think there is an opportunity through community networks or through other type of activities that I would encourage you to bring or to facilitate that more women participate in telecoms. That is, at the end of the day, the space where you work the most. So maybe explore that rather than, but anyway, thank you.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Carlos. We're actually, the next workshop is here, and we're waiting to get the room. We know we got started a little late, but I'm afraid we need to wrap up now. So I'd like to encourage anyone that has questions to approach Duncan, Vimal, and myself. We thank you, Carlos, Joanna, and Asha, for your interventions today, and for everyone, and to everyone for coming today as well. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I think we should start. Apologies for the slight delay. The session before us ran over slightly. But thank you very much for coming, for attending this session for our panel on digital inclusion for women, scaling up our efforts. My name is Helen Croxon. I'm Market Insights Director for the GSMA Connected Women team, and I'm going to get our panel to introduce themselves in a second. But just to say that our focus today is very much about investigating how we can tackle the gender divide in mobile internet access and usage. So we're going to start by discussing the problem and the problem that exists, the fact that more men than women in every region access the internet. And then we're going to talk about how this issue is being tackled at the moment. And we're going to move on to discussing actually how, moving forward, what should we be focusing on, what should we think about. And I'm sure you're all very, very aware that ensuring digital inclusion for all is incredibly important, because on a macro level, the internet's become increasingly important in driving economic growth and development. Internet use is rapidly rising. It opens access to information, services, opportunities, and greater contact with global markets. But on a micro level, on an individual level, on a personal level, it's so important because it can be a source for social and economic development. It democratizes access to information. It expands people's capacity for personal development, and it makes available services and life-enhancing opportunities such as health information, guidance, financial services, employment opportunities, often for the first time to many, many people. So, you know, it helps to promote and protect human rights and advance social and political empowerment. So on an individual level, it's crucial that we push for digital inclusion. And adoption and use of the internet is very, very linked to mobile, because for many people, this is their first and only way to access the internet through their mobile devices. I think why we're here today is because you get a lot of regional differences in internet uptake. Within markets, you've got a lot of inequalities and differences in uptake, whether it be between urban and rural or different sectors of society, particularly women. And women are not a minority, they're half the population. So it's incredibly important to make sure that, given the growing importance for internet, for accessing all these life-enhancing services, for the role that women play within the family, within society, for their potential contributions to the economy, that we ensure that we have female digital inclusion. So at this point, I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves. We're very, very lucky to have some great panelists here with a wealth of information from a variety of sectors. So I'm going to start with Rachel. Are you all right to introduce yourself, and then we will move on?
Thank you, Helen. Rachel Samrin. I'm the Chief External Affairs Officer of Millicom, which perhaps is better known by the brand name of Tigo. And we are a mobile media company operating in both Africa and Latin America, but we're solely emerging markets focused, so slightly different than most other operators. We're also a significant player in mobile financial services, or mobile money as it's also referred to. So very, very focused both on digital and financial inclusion, rural connectivity, and similar. Personally, like Helen, of course, very, very enthusiastic and very focused on our female customers, our female employees. As she said, it's half of the population, it's half of our talent pool, it's half of our consumers. So as important, if not more important, than our male consumers, since actually women make most of the household spending decisions. So it's something we spend a lot of time on, and of course incredibly important in our markets in particular, where I believe in sub-Saharan Africa, it's about 67%, and in Latin America and the Caribbean, 49% of women are still unconnected completely. They are not even actually accessing the internet. So it's something we spend a lot of time on.
Hi, good morning. My name is Chat Garcia Ramelo, and I am from the Association for Progressive Communications. I'm the executive director of the network. We are an international global network. We have members in about 35 countries, 58 organizations. Our members work on many different issues, including access, including human rights and development. And one of the key areas that we work in is around gender equality as well as women's rights. And in all of the work that we do, we make sure that we do have that analysis and that we include that in everything that our members and also our work, in also all of our work. So hopefully to contribute here around focusing on access, the barriers around access, and also some ideas around how we can move that forward in relation to much more local access that ensures that the most marginalized really are addressed.
Good morning. My name is Nanjira Sambuli. I'm with the World Wide Web Foundation, which is an organization set up by Sir Tim Berners-Lee to advance the mission that the web be for everyone. I coordinate our work on research and advocacy on women's rights online, which is a network in 17 countries that has been looking at what specifically are the gendered gaps in access and use to the internet, and taking those recommendations, working at a local, regional, and global level with all actors to close them. Thank you.
Thank you. Doreen?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Doreen Bogdan-Martin, and I'm the Chief of Strategy at the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, which is headquartered just across the street. ITU, as many of you may know, is the oldest organization in the UN system. It dates back to 1865, and its mission is all around connectivity. So making sure that all of the world's people, men, women, boys, and girls, have opportunities to be connected and to be able to experience the benefits of connectivity. Our work spans from development to standards to radio communications. And for us, when we look at the 2030 UN agenda, it's about not only leaving no one behind, but making sure that we leave no one offline. So I'm very happy to be here amongst this distinguished group of panelists. And maybe for those colleagues that are following remotely, we do have an all-female panel. But what's great is that in the audience, we actually have, I think, almost a gender-balanced audience, which I think is also really great. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Good morning. My name is Anna Felt. I'm from UN Women. I'm leading UN Women's work on private sector engagement, women's economic empowerment, and specifically in this area with STEM and technology. And contrary to ITU, UN Women is the newest organization in the system. Shockingly, because we are 50% of the population. So we are focusing on a number of areas, economic empowerment being one of them, with STEM and ICT as a great focus. But we also work on ending violence against women, peace and security, and women in political participation, humanitarian action, and many other things. I'm also very happy to be here and to be with this distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves. The way the session is going to go today, we're going to have a discussion on the panel for about half an hour, and then we're going to open up for questions from the audience as well. So please have a think of things that you would like to ask this wonderful selection of people we have here to talk about this issue. So I'm going to start off. Doreen, when it comes to internet access and usage, what do we know about who's being left behind at the moment and by how much?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Helen. So maybe, again, to put some perspective, as you said, about who's sort of left behind, we know that today there are 3.9 billion people that are currently not connected, so more than half of the world's population is still not connected. We know that 2 out of 3 of those not connected reside in the Asia-Pacific region. We know that many of them live in rural areas, and we also know that vulnerable groups are those that are the most affected, and that means women and girls. Our latest ITU statistics show that the digital gender gap is actually growing. It's growing most in Africa. We see it closing, and in some cases women outnumber men in Europe and in some countries in the Americas region. But we are quite concerned because the gap seems to be growing in certain parts of the world, and we think that we need to take swift actions to close the gap. We think that we need to be focusing on affordability issues because we know that a number of the barriers around women's access to the internet are a result of affordability issues, that it's far too expensive. So that needs to be tackled. We also believe that threats, cybersecurity issues can also hamper women's access and use of ICTs. Digital literacy is also a problem, so women and girls often lack the skills that they need once they get connected in order to be able to make effective use of that connectivity. And there's also a concern around the lack of relevant content. So apps, services that may benefit women are lacking. And we know that that is also the result of the fact that there are so few women out there that are actually creating content. And it's sort of a vicious circle, but maybe I'll get into that later in the next round. Thank you.
Thank you, Doreen. And Chat, I know you've been doing some research recently into this area, looking at the barriers that are preventing women getting online. Is there anything that you could share with us on what you've been doing?
A lot of it is just to add to what Doreen was saying, because these are definitely some of the most important ones. I think the other I want to look at threats, one, and also around vulnerabilities, because I think vulnerabilities, yes, women are more vulnerable than men, but among women and girls, there are more vulnerable groups. And I do think we need to understand that there are differences there, that women are not equal, do not all have equal access. So it's also differences in relation to access. So I think in the first thing, a trend, for example, that we're seeing around criminalization of behavior. And that's quite important. Women might have access, but more and more, a lot of behavior is being criminalized. And what kinds of behaviors are these? That would be around sexual expression. That will be around when women and girls are actually outside of what religious institutions might want, that behavior. So I think the behavior that is offline is being then when women and girls find ways to actually find much more freedom, expression, you find that it's also being transferred online. And the criminalization part is very important here, because I think it really does. The point of access is not simply to have access. It has to be around agency, and it has to be around empowerment. The other point around is that around access, the vulnerabilities is, again, to see what kinds of women, because I don't think there's differences. Indigenous women will have different vulnerabilities than women who are in rural areas or who are in urban areas. And I think those issues need to come in when we're looking at research, when we're looking at finding evidence as to how to really understand the issues around lack of access.
Thank you. Some really interesting points there, and I think some that we will hear again as themes going through. Anna, I just wondered if you wanted to add anything on from your work that you've been doing with UN Women. I know that we've had some conversations about not just the issue being about access to the internet, but also about encouraging usage.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that goes back to the relevance of the content. And in some countries, having access to a phone or having access to the internet means something negative in the local community. It means that you have access to being unfaithful. You have access to getting content that it's not socially or culturally acceptable. But I think we need to work much more on raising awareness of what internet actually brings. We had a conversation with one of our partners in Brazil where they think that if you have access to the internet and the phone, it means that you will be on social media and that's limited. The perception is that internet is social media, and social media means that professionally you might become a fashion journalist. So it's very limited in what people actually perceive of being the internet, and I think we need to do much more in driving that attention. I'd like to also bring a little different dimension to the cyber violence. I think we need to have much more data that explains what is happening. We have already a few studies on what it means generally to the economy and the cost to the workplace, for example. When violence is happening, we don't have enough data on showing specifically on cyber violence. But just to give two examples, one from PNG, Papua New Guinea, where the study shows that domestic violence has a cost of 5% of payroll to companies, which is quite a lot, which means that they have calculated absenteeism at work. They have calculated different options that women are taking when they're being exposed to violence. So what does it mean if women are exposed to cyber violence? What impact does it have? Will they limit their education opportunities online? Will it limit their opportunities for employment? What does it actually mean? And I think we need to go much deeper into that. The other example is from Egypt, where they calculated the cost of harassment in the public place. It's about $20, $25 per incident, with the social and personal implication of the violence. So we need to understand better what impact cyber violence actually have on women.
I think that's really fascinating, because it's something at the GSMA we have been looking into recently, actually, is this barrier to access and adoption of internet and actually all technologies to do with mobile, that is concerns around safety and being harassed. And I have to say that there's definitely a lack of data out there. It's very, it's almost impossible to size this issue or to track it down. And I think the other thing that really speaks to me as well is what you were saying about the perception of the internet, because we've recently been doing some research. We've done a new report about triggering mobile internet adoption amongst men and women in South Asia, which is focused very much on people who already have a phone, who have the potential to adopt. And perception of the internet is so important. We did it in 2 markets in Africa, and particularly in the 2 African markets. There's a very much an association with the internet and social media. They're synonymous with each other. And then what happens is that they don't see the benefits, which is going back to what you guys said. So that it's like, well, if it's social media, I don't need it. And in the Asian market, certainly it was a bit like, well, this is a bit frivolous. Why should I spend money on it? It's not value for money. And so then, again, the perception is holding people back, because they're not seeing the real benefits they can get from it. I would like to ask Nanjira, so we've just been talking about some of the barriers that exist to women getting online. But if we move on to what's actually being done to help women to get access to the internet, you know, what have you been seeing that you think is happening at the moment and is working well?
Just before I answer that question, I think at some point, what the issue of perceptions on getting online, we may have to start discussing whether mobile first is creating a new divide in perception of what the internet is as this frivolous space versus accessing the internet via other devices. Because I don't know about many of you, and the first time you came online was probably a computer, a desktop type device, and maybe it was those perception that it was serious, focused, the future is on that laptop kind of thing. But speaking to what seems to be working, proven impossible, I'll take the perspective of what I've seen governments doing, as I believe that it all starts with the governments. So one good example is in Costa Rica, through a program called Connected Homes. They provide subsidies to low-income households to buy fixed computers, and rather fixed bandwidth and a computer. Now, what's interesting about that is approximately 95% of the households that qualify for that subsidy are actually female-led. So that has been leading towards getting that to that point of access. And so now that they've been able to see that this is one way to start closing the divide at the point of access, it could be expanded upon to even go towards mobile connectivity and other ways that people can connect to the internet. Another example that is taking a mobile-first access approach from a government level is in Colombia, which the government has a specific program that targets people who've never been online before. And it targets the affordability issue from both the cost of data and the cost of devices. So what they do is they provide like a 3 to 4 GB mobile data package for a very reduced tariff that costs approximately $2, and with free access between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. So I think that's an incentive for people to just, even if it's social media, test it out kind of thing. And they also give them an opportunity to purchase a subsidized 4G smartphone, which I think is really good. And on top of that, has free access to online government services, educational content, social networks, and such. So that kind of approach, I think, has been incentivizing people who have never been online before to get online. And last but not least, I think we're starting to see some proven and possible work with public access solutions, and I know Chat will have more to share about that.
Fantastic, Chat.
I'd second that. I think it's like, yes, mobile is very important. I think it really has made a difference in terms of just much more access. But I do think we have to provide connectivity in all its, differences. I guess multiplicity. But I want to talk about just one more example to just add to these examples, because I think it's quite important to see what works on the ground. So one of our members and we've been working on is the idea around local access. So really to focus much more on not so much at scale. I mean, scale is something that's important, but I do think that when you talk about scale, again, you're not looking at differences at the local level. What's the local need? So then local access, one example is in Oaxaca, we have that this is quite known by now. It's Rhizomatica. It's an organization that provides community telecommunications infrastructure. They work with an organization called Telecommunications Indigenous Communities. It's the first ever fully licensed community-owned and operated GSM network. And they actually provide connectivity to their indigenous communities. I believe it's about 16 communities in different parts of Oaxaca. And Oaxaca is a state where there's a lot of indigenous communities. So, and the beauty of this is that they own the network, they price the access. It's about $2 a month is what they pay, and if you see the difference in terms of what they can afford and these are areas where there's no connectivity, there's no service. But even there, I mean, it's so that the idea is for them to then look at that network also and to be able then to, number one, address what are the local needs for women. And one of the things we're working with them on is looking at a social impact and gender impact downstream. So saying, okay, you've got access, how does that then look at? We look at that in relation to access, in relation to women and men, and as well as economic opportunities that connectivity provides. So I'll leave it there. There are other examples that I might share later on.
Thank you, Nanjir and Chat. There's some really good examples, and I think you've both talked about examples that are government examples or NGO. Rachel, I'd really like to understand, you're obviously from the private sector with Millicom. What is it that the private sector is currently doing to help get women online?
Well, I think, Helen, each operator has its own program and does different things. But speaking certainly from Millicom's perspective, I mean, as I said at the outset, for us working with these issues is a no-brainer. I mean, there's just no other option. First of all, it's 50% of our talent pool, and it's 50% of our potential consumer pool. But also, more importantly, we do want to connect everyone. That is really our ambition of where we are. Now, I think one important point to make is that no one can solve this issue on their own. It's not an issue that the private sector can address on its own. It's not an issue that the government can address on its own, nor the NGO world. So I think a key point from our perspective is partnerships and collaboration. That's really the only way that we will actually be able to close the gender gap. I think that's equally something that just has to be an accepted fact. Taking that as a starting point, we have focused a lot on looking at this analytically and then working out how can we best collaborate to address this, how can we best use our expertise. You've heard some of the barriers being mentioned, and that's very much the starting point that we've taken. Find out first, what is it that actually prevents women from having more access? We've done that together with GSMA through the Connected Women program. I think we were the first operator to have all our African operations sign up to the commitment. We then took the initiative to Latin America, where we're just missing one country to actually complete the entire world in terms of having all our operations working with Connected Women to get access to research and data beyond what we have, because we have, of course, for our consumer base, but we need more than that to understand who are not the consumers. So first of all, research and really understanding the data that's available together with partners like the GSMA, with local NGOs, especially those that are focused on women's empowerment. And then saying, okay, so what is the part that we can play in then actually addressing those barriers? As mentioned, a lot of it comes down to understanding and knowledge. And knowledge is not only about knowing how to use a smartphone or the internet, it's also exactly about understanding its value. So we spend a lot of time on training, first of all training our own staff to then train women in the communities. We spend a lot of time on training sales agents, female sales agents, because we know, as was mentioned, that sometimes women might have psychological barriers and will feel much more comfortable actually being addressed by female agents rather than male. It also sometimes does help with the perception that this is not something that women should really get into if you have a woman explaining to you why it can really help you in your daily life. Having classroom sessions, simply using a smartphone, how to use it, what it can do for you, but then also really trying to take it a step further to address some of the points that Doreen mentioned when it comes to allowing for women also to become entrepreneurs, allowing for women also to become the innovators in this sector. In Honduras, for example, we're working with groups of craftswomen in rural areas where we're not only teaching them how to use smartphones, but we're also teaching them how to set up a mobile money wallet, how to create their own internet pages so they can sell their crafts online, can save that money through the mobile money wallet, and thereby really become contributors to the local economy, as well as much more financially independent. That's just one example. In Chad, we've had female savings communities where women who work in the same trade craft pool their money, again through the help of also then mobile money wallets, again allowing them much more financial independence while learning about how they can use the internet further, so they then spend the money on that. All of this is one ecosystem, and it's one cycle where everyone has to sort of play their part. We can, of course, try and educate women as to why the internet can help them, but we might not be seen as the right authority because we are a commercial entity. So we can have the best of intentions, but they might still be doubted. And that's why we need everyone to contribute their expertise, for the government, from the education ministries to help with the education, the NGO world, help the ministries work out where they need to target, which areas are perhaps more vulnerable, for tribal and religious leaders to also be part of this effort to indeed overcome some of the negative perceptions that we heard about. But from an operator perspective, certainly a lot of innovative ideas. And last but not least, also focusing on having more females in senior positions inside the company. Because the more role models we have and the more female minds we have working on the products that we can offer to indeed address also affordability and to attract female consumers, the more we can also expand that ecosystem. So you know, there's so many angles to it, but we're trying to really take a holistic view and add our expertise, because we cannot solve it on our own, but we'd certainly like to contribute where we can make most of a difference.
Thank you, Rachel. Rachel mentioned there the GSMA Connected Women Commitment Initiative, which is something we launched back in February 2016, whereby we're working with operators across low and middle income markets and encouraging them to make a commitment to reduce the gender gap in either their mobile money base or their mobile internet base. And delighted to say that to date we have commitments from 33 different mobile operators, including the vast majority of the Tigo ones, and they have made between them 47 commitments. So some of those commitments will be in mobile money, a lot of them will be in mobile internet. And so we're working with these operators, and it's a massive effort by the private sector. So it's good to see that there's so much momentum and impetus behind it. So by 2020, hopefully we will see some tangible differences. I think what we've been talking about are some lovely examples of how people are trying to tackle the gender gap. But Anna, I was going to ask you, obviously people are making efforts to tackle the gender gap, to encourage female digital inclusion. But, as Dorian alluded to earlier on, in some places actually this digital divide is increasing. What is it that we could do differently to try and scale it up and to try and accelerate digital inclusion rather than see it almost going backwards in some places?
Thank you. I'd like to go back to the point on partnerships, and I know, and I believe that Doreen will talk a little bit about equals later, but I do think that for us to make progress, we really need to come together all of the different partners, whether it's government or government policies, private sector, civil society working on the ground, and us in the UN system. We are trying to bring everyone together. I think there's, in addition to bringing the different partners together, there's a lot of awareness raising to be done. And I think if we look at children starting in school, what we don't have is enough education already from the outset. The education about what internet is about, what it brings, and also about the cyber bullying, etc., and how to behave. It's not something that a lot of young people think that they can be different people online than they are in reality. And why is it not, I would like to bring another point on that, but you have the offline world and the online world, and suddenly, because you get online, you think that you're invisible. And it was quite interesting I'm actually bringing back another example from Brazil, where there was a lot of cyberbullying. And what they did was to kind of match the online space with the offline space. So they took the words of the bulliers, if that's what you call them, and they put them on big billboards with the social media account, and in their neighborhood. So they were, through the geotagging, they were actually able to find where they lived, and they put the words on a billboard, racial, sexual, whatever remarks they had done out on the billboards. And they created a big campaign out of this, and they actually had a lot of men coming and apologizing. They hadn't realized that whatever they wouldn't do in the offline space, they would actually do it online, and how real it became that they saw it in front of them, and they realized that it was a big problem. I think from the other perspective on the online and the offline, with the learning part of it, is that a lot of institutions believe that if you just take the content and put it online, it would help. And you can't just take a textbook and just put it online. You need to bring it into the online space. And I think these are some of the challenges as well, that we need to understand the digital world to be able to craft the content accordingly. And we had last week a session in the UAE where we had a teacher. She was very happy and excited that they were using social media in the classroom. And this is also another challenge, that social media is built and based on algorithms. And what people don't realize is that if they express interest in a certain type of content, that's the content that will be served. So it actually silos people's mind, that if in the US you will have US content, but you wouldn't be served content from Africa or from Asia. This is a problem in today's world, where we see more and more of this outrageous comments online, that people are not exposed to diversity, and they are not exposed to inclusion and messages that we would want them to access. So it becomes a very siloed, and people are not exposed to real life. So I just want to bring up that linkage between online and offline. But partnership is definitely the way forward, and I expect Doreen to maybe talk a little bit about the partnership that we have with GSMA, ITU, ITC, and UNU and UN Women to bridge the gender digital divide. Right?
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you, Anna. And perfect segue, yes. Doreen, I know that from the recent report that the Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development Working Group on the Digital Gender Divide, that recent report has got some very clear recommendations for a group of stakeholders on how we should tackle the gender gap in digital inclusion. Can you tell us about some of them, please?
Okay, thank you. So I would say first, in order to be able to scale, and this is where the Broadband Commission report comes in, you need to have commitment. And you need to have commitment at the highest level, and also coming back to what Chat was saying, at the local level too. Because it's not just sort of one solution for all. We need to be sensitive to local needs. But commitment is key. And we believe that this is a real leadership imperative that we need to be bridging the digital gender divide. One of the things that we're doing in the ITU is something called Girls in ICT Day. It's celebrated on the 4th Thursday of the 4th month. It's something we've been running since 2010. And over 160 countries have done celebrations, and we've tapped into hundreds of thousands of girls around the world, and it's about raising awareness of the importance of careers in the ICT sector. Now, on the Broadband Commission side, for those of you that don't know the Broadband Commission, it's the Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development. It brings together some 50 personalities from around the world. It's co-chaired by Carlos Slim and President Kagame, and the co-vice chairs are the ITU Secretary General and the UNESCO Director General. The Broadband Commission Working Group on the Digital Gender Gap was led by the GSMA head, Matt Scranyard, and the Director General of UNESCO, and they came out with a number of recommendations. Those recommendations have to do with data, and we've heard lots of references to the importance of getting better data, so that's key. The second recommendation was around having a gender perspective in strategies, policies, and plans, and then perhaps even more importantly, having a budget associated to that. We often have great plans, but when there's no budget, nothing happens. The third recommendation was around addressing barriers. I alluded to some of those before, the barriers around access, so the cybersecurity, affordability, skills, and content. And then the fourth one is about working together, partnerships, and that's where Anna's comments come in about the need for all of us to really be coming together to make a difference. What's good about this report of the Broadband Commission is that the chair of the group, in particular Matt Scranyard, has insisted that those involved continue to report on their commitments. So APC, the Web Foundation, and a number of others are continuously committing. They're telling us what they're doing, so that's great. It keeps everything alive. And ITU and UN Women have come together with this Equals partnership, and so that's tackling the fourth recommendation in particular of this Broadband Commission group. And through the Equals partnership, we have brought together over 50 entities, more than 25 academic institutions, and over 25 government, civil society, and private sector organizations that have come together in the form of a partnership where we will be tackling access, skills, and leadership. And leadership was also referred to before. And I just wanted to mention there's so many great things out there. We've done a digital mapping of these initiatives through the Equals partnership, so we've mapped some 550 initiatives. There's plenty of other initiatives out there, but when you see a good practice, it's certainly worth sharing, and we hope that many of those good practices can be shared. And I'd like to take the opportunity to inform you that tomorrow night at 5 o'clock in room 18, I believe, we will be having the Equals Award ceremony. And And that's an opportunity to see some of these best practices. We had some 300 nominations from around the world, 15 finalists, and tomorrow night we will be hearing from our 3 winners, and those are 3 great stories that are certainly worth replicating. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Hopefully quite a few of you will make that tomorrow evening. Thank you very much. So thinking about moving forward and how we tackle this issue, Nanjia, is there anything that you think, right, okay, this is what you've been thinking about that we should focus on or that you've seen?
Yeah, and I'll I guess address my intervention on this as far as the role of governments go, and also a bit by extension development community in pressuring or keeping government on their toes and bringing in their commitments, as Doreen was talking about. Now, often when you even constitute these panels, you'll find none of us represents government. It's the usual thing. In the audience, we may have 1 or 2. But what happens is, if they're not already in the conversation, where do we get them to understand and appreciate that this is an issue? Where is it that we get them to also commit to addressing this issue? And why they have to be involved from the get-go is the digital gender divide, as we know it today, is a result of policy failure. So all our interventions, whether we are private sector, whether we are civil society, will only go as far as how they're aligned with the national or regional government's plans to actually take on long-term investments. And why I bring up policy is because what the right policy environment does is it helps us to identify long-term ways to successfully address these issues. So if we have, it ensures that we have all entry points if we're working in one country. So if Millicom or Tigo is working in Tanzania, the Web Foundation is working in Tanzania, UN Women is working in Tanzania, we've all identified and diagnosed something. How does it all fit back together for the goodness of, say, the Tanzanian community? That's what the right policy environment does. Then it helps us to identify, once we have a proper diagnostic, and which we're feeding into, the investment mechanisms, so that all our efforts, time, money, anything we're able to bring to the table is measurable. We talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and measuring progress. Part of the challenge why we keep coming back and asking for more data is, well, how do we all bring it into one space to help us understand who has done what for what community, what's proven and possible, how do we make sure we don't duplicate efforts that we find, I leave here with a training, then, I don't know, some other organization comes tomorrow, trains the same people over and over again, and unfortunately that's been happening. So good resources are going to waste. But last and not least, these policies have to be gender responsive. This whole idea that everything from the point of how infrastructure is being designed, it considers where the women and girls are or where marginalized communities are. To be able to make sure that right from the get-go, the mechanisms that are employed by all actors consider who women and girls, where they are, what's missing, all these issues, because the digital gender divide is also taking on very traditional issues of inequalities. But if we get this right, it is possible. And the development community then comes in to pressure and take on this messaging, especially for those that work bilaterally with governments, to make sure that they make these commitments something that they hold on to and commit, have governments commit to saying, you know what, we will have to report back because, well, you have the money. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, first of all, that I absolutely couldn't agree more, and I think to maybe put that into sort of how we see this, it's also a question of that, not only everyone contributing their expertise and collaborating, but it's also that we need to all lose our sense of pride and competition. Now, of course, as a private sector entity, we're known to be notoriously competitive, but this is one of those issues where competition only hinders efforts, and we've taken that view a long time ago, but I think that is equally applicable to indeed governments and NGOs, because like you said, there's a lot of duplication. So we see a lot of NGOs wanting to do the same thing. And we also, so that competition really needs to go, because it's really, it's actually becoming wasteful, and it's slowing down efforts. Secondly, I think from the government perspective, the competition is more in terms of them wanting to show that they are doing the right thing for populations. Again, that mindset needs to go, and we need to take a view that we can all do this together. In a very different manner, so sort of turn the tables a little bit. But I'd like to add one point, coming back to what Anna brought up in terms of children and schools. And I'd like to make a comparison with another gender gap discussion, which is about, women in senior positions, not just in the tech industry, but in general, and women on board. Lots of effort is being put into changing the statistics there. A number of countries are legislating for it. I'm myself from Sweden, one of the countries that's perhaps been most advanced in this. But we have a problem even there in terms of the next generation. Because if you're just addressing the problem as it is, you're not addressing what comes next in the pipeline. And I would like to actually transpose exactly that also on this debate. If we don't focus on the schools, on the young children, on the connectivity and education, as Anna was saying, then whatever we address here at the existing women level will not actually help us for the future, unfortunately. Of course, women have a tremendous role to play in educating their children, but we can't forget about the children and the schools and the education and the training that we need there. I mean, we work a lot with civil society. Costa Rica actually is one of the examples where we work together with the foundation Fundación Pan y Amor, which is Central America, Creative Crianza Tecnológica, which is actually an online education platform for parents with modules where they can learn how they can help their children get online, and more importantly, how they can get online safely. We work with plenty of governments in terms of connecting schools as part of the Organization of American States committed to connecting all schools in the region by 2030. We hope to get there a lot sooner. Just signed an MOU with the Tanzanian government, in the first one ever on large scale to connect schools there. But connection in itself, as we know, is not enough. Even when we have 4G broadband available in so many countries, it's about actually knowing how to use it. And that does really have to trickle down also to the school and the girls' level, because otherwise we'll be addressing the problem only for short term, and we'll have to redo it all over again when they grow up if they don't feel comfortable using the internet. And of course, protecting them as well. So child rights, impact assessment, as we worked on with UNICEF, are a crucial part of this to understand where are the risks and where are the opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you. We're getting some really interesting thoughts and ideas out, but I'm aware of time, so I would now like to open up for any questions from the floor. Is there anybody amongst you who has questions for our panel? If you do, and it's for a specific member of the panel, please can you just make it clear who it is you're asking the question of, and also make sure that it is framed as a question. Thank you. Is there anybody that would like to kick off with a question? Oh, please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting discussion. I have more of a comment and a question. It is true that women find it difficult to access internet due to various issues such as lack of accessibility, lack of affordability, including some of other points that you have raised. But if I illustrate you an example from my personal experience, some of the women, I'm from Sri Lanka, so most of the women in Sri Lanka do have access to internet, and they're also quite active in their personal sphere on Facebook. But when it comes to having a discussion on social issues, and particularly there's this Facebook page that we have been running to flag media ethics violations on a daily basis, women are reluctant to take part, mainly because of the fear of being subject to cyberbullying. Do you have any similar experiences to share, any of the panelists from your part of the world? And maybe this is something that we can also focus on, because given the fact that there are maybe facilities to access internet, there can be other social elements like that perception that you mentioned. And I'm also curious to know if that perception where you said that internet is synonymous to this idea that, oh, you don't want to be on social media, is it something that you have found particular to a certain region? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think Nanjira, you wanted to respond.
I'll definitely take one half, and I know Chat will want to take the other. On the issue of civic and political participation, you're right on the mark, but this is what research that we conducted in urban poor communities in 10 cities found that while that is an issue, when women are actually politically active offline, then they're more likely to use the medium, that is the internet, whichever way they're connected, to be active online, which shows you that we also must never fall for this idea that technology in and of itself will fill the gaps of how women have been perceived in society in the spaces that they can occupy. Now, the other point to that is also there's such a need for role models, ourselves especially, those of us who understand these issues, to be seen to speak to these things. Then that helps a lot with women, and especially younger women, getting online and seeing that, you know, it's not just a space to post selfies, nothing wrong with that, but you can have a political voice as well. There's such a need for role models, people who are, as I call it, ungovernable, if you will, to speak up and show that it's a roadmap that others can follow. But yeah, it's a link to the offline world as well. Yeah.
I guess to the question of if it is particular just to one area, absolutely not. I think it is definitely a global experience. How it plays out might be different. One of the things that if you are looking for resources, I would offer you, we've been doing a lot of work around awareness raising and around also safety. How do we engage the internet safely? So one of the campaigns that we've done for the last 10 years is Take Back the Tech, which is really looking at different aspects, sharing experiences, looking at different resources. So I can talk to you later on and I can show you some of those.
Fantastic. I think, Anna, you've also got some thoughts on this you'd like to share.
Yeah. We've been running a platform, empowerwomen.org, over the past 4 years. And it's been quite an interesting experience where we were set up. We got funding from the Government of Canada to set it up and to be a hub to discuss women's economic empowerment issues. What we realized that there were not so many professionals that wanted to discuss their technical expertise, but rather young women who wanted to understand and connect with other women in a safe space. It actually led to, we let them understand that each woman is an expert on her own empowerment. Everybody has an idea on what empowerment means to them. And we've had a lot of campaigns where they've been discussing these kind of sometimes intimate questions. Where we once had a girl from Bangladesh asking, I don't really understand this thing with empowerment. How does it link with marriage? So they got into quite intimate discussions, actually, and what empowerment means, and they felt quite secure to do so, and whether empowerment comes first and marriage after, or it can actually be in combination. So it just shows that the girls were confident enough in a closed space on a particular issue to have those kind of conversations. And I think it's social media can be quite brutal, and to show your emotions and your inner feelings on social media can sometimes be intimidating. And I think it's important, no matter what space, to create a safe space where you feel that you can talk about these things.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I think we have a question from over. You want to? Yeah.
Hi, my name is
Buck. We'll go to the gentleman over there after. Yeah. Oh, and then, yeah, if you'd like to go ahead. And then we'll
my name is Baka Janif. I work with Columbia University's Global Freedom of Expression Initiative in New York. And to develop a little bit on the comment that was raised before about cyberbullying, I'm wondering if the speakers could comment on the idea of using content regulation to respond to cyberbullying, because a lot of times, you know, the response to aggressive speech or vitriolic speech is more speech, and we're seeing that's not really effective. And so, you know, the question is then, do we regulate content? And if we do, it would be also interesting if speakers could say we should regulate content depending on the context of the country where the speech originates in. So if it's a country where women are generally lack a lot of opportunities, maybe there we should be a bit more aggressive with regulation. Thank you.
I would say, I think if you go down the line of regulating content, then it's really down the path where you should say, it's not one question you'd ask is that who regulates content? What kind of content is regulated? And I think you're going down the path that it's sort of like there's no bottom to it. So I do think what you would focus more on is as you say, more speech, but more speech doesn't mean that you do this, you sort of engage directly. There are, I think, different ways of engaging speech, which is, there is some value in retreating to some extent, because then this space is not useful for you, and find safer spaces. There is a strategy where you find support in your network, different kinds of networks that can really provide that support for women who are, let's say, being attacked. And for example, one of the Take Back the Tech campaign that I was talking about was attacked like 2 years ago. And it was such a campaign that was very aggressive, that was brutal. And what we did really is we made sure that we talked to our campaign network. We made sure that we had strategies to keep ourselves safe and not that no individual is attacked. And we looked after ourselves. So that's one of the things we'd look at. But not to, we were very careful around content regulation. But at the same time, we're also saying that there is gender-based violence, and there's gender-based, there's speech that is about hate speech that is based on gender. So I think understanding that more is very important.
Thank you, Chat. Thank you. I'm just checking if I don't think we've got any questions coming from online at the moment. There's a gentleman down there who had a question. If you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm not seeing anyone. I am a visually impaired person, and grateful to the SEED Alliance, because SEED Alliance shows me the exact way about the internet governance issues. In 2014, I was one of the awardee of ISIF Asia award for multimedia talking books. So thank you. My questions, when you are talking about the inclusiveness, how you are considering the women with disabilities who have a double discrimination to accessing internet. Believe me, if we have the technology, if women and girls have the technology and internet, they can live an independent life without any barrier, and they can enjoy all the rights by accessing technology such as a smartphone, a computer, and other things. And internet is a basic human rights now for women and girls with disabilities. And it can overcome all the disabilities if we can properly use that. So do you consider anything about the girls and women with disabilities? Because inclusive, this word is for us, for people with disabilities. We cannot ignore the 1 billion people who exist. And we cannot achieve SDG by 2030 by ignoring women and girls with disabilities who have a double discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you. I think so the question here is what action is being done for those who are female and with disability. I mean, you're totally right that it is, as you say, double discrimination and probably doubly hard for them to get online. I mean, I'm personally aware that the Equals Research Council, there has been discussion about investigating this area from some of the people involved in the research coalition. I mean, I don't know if anybody on the panel has seen any examples of what's been done. Rachel, I think.
Well, no, but I'd rather actually make comments. I mean, certainly from our perspective, whether it's with regards to women or more generally, we make no distinction as to who should be digitally or financially included. So all efforts should always target, the entire population. That also goes for employment within the company, where we again, like I said, it's also about having diversity of mind within the company. So we have specific efforts there to also ensure that we really have everyone included. So we think about all consumers, whichever background they come from. I think, however, I'd like to add to the question's more comment that it does pose challenges in some countries where the government's role will be very important to address this, because disabilities are not necessarily out in the open from the government's perspective, sadly. In some of the markets where we operate, that is still the reality, which makes it much harder for us to target specific groups to begin with if they aren't actually identified or if they aren't put into sort of the access to us for vulnerable groupings, like we say that women are among the vulnerable. And I think that we really need to get better at working with governments there on acknowledging and identifying that need, first of all, because that is certainly a challenge that we see in some of our markets, that they aren't actually necessarily recognized by their own governments as a group. They are certainly by certain very brave civil society organizations that we work with, but not necessarily more broadly.
Thank you, Rachel. So I think it sounds a bit that we also need to go back to understanding the problem, understanding where people are discriminated, understanding why women are being kept offline, and within women, what are the different segments that are struggling to find it harder. Did anybody have anything to add? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's one issue is to understand the problem, but also to understand the solutions. So there are solutions, for example, for visually impaired people going online, but how accessible is that software to the broader public? And we've been working with a hearing impaired woman, young woman in Canada, and she said actually through the internet, it was the first time that she was able to have a conversation with somebody who was visually impaired. So for the first time, it actually can, they can actually come together and work in groups and really try to push this agenda. But I think the understanding of the solutions is very important.
Thank you. The lady here right in front of me, please.
Thank you very much. Listening to the discussions, I think I'm taken back to a comment that Rachel made earlier, where the importance of partnerships can only help this agenda move forward. And what I'd like to hear from you is, how does that actually play out in reality? Because we do have an issue of competition, duplication that is going on and on. We're in 2017, soon 2018, and this replication needs, I don't know, to be addressed very seriously. But I'd like to hear from you, how does the notion of partnership actually play out in reality? Because there's this sense of, territorialness, if I may call it that, with how we do development.
Great question. So we understand that partnership's important, but how's it working in reality, and how could it work going forward? Does anyone particularly? I think lots of people want to answer this question. So should we start with Doreen and then move to Nanjira and Chad?
Good question, and certainly it's not always easy. I think one of the good things is that the digital gender gap has been recognized by, most recently by the General Assembly's second committee. My colleague Ursula is in the room. And there's a whole paragraph on everybody needing to come together to address the digital gender gap, the Women's 20 through the G20. So we have all of these great words. And then how do the words end up in action? And that's where we have to figure out the right partnership models. And it's not always easy. Even with my colleague and sister here from UN Women, it's not always easy, even on the UN front, to partner and to share, right? Because we each have our own respective mandates, but we need to figure out ways to come together. And that's really what we're trying to do through this Equals partnership. It's kind of a concept that we came up with, and we've been trying to perfect it over the past several months, where we have a number of UN agencies. We have GSMA, we have civil society, we have the Web Foundation, we have APC. We have lots of different entities. We have governments, and what we're trying to do is figure out who's doing what where, and how can we bring those things together. If Anna's doing a project in Tanzania, maybe I can help her, or maybe she can help me in Mozambique. We have some specific examples where the World Economic Forum is also part of the Equals Partnership, and they have this program called the Internet for All Initiative, where they're going specifically in countries. So one of the countries is Rwanda, and they have decided to add an equals track to the Internet for All partnership. So working closely with the Digital Opportunities Trust, we're rolling out digital skills programs to women in Rwanda. So it's a way of kind of connecting the dots and bringing people together to really try to make it happen. I think there's different levels of partnerships, but Equals is really trying to be a framework to first see who's doing what, and then figure out how we can come together, combine efforts, and really figure out a way to maximize, in some cases, very limited resources.
Thank you, Joanne. And Rachel, you had something you want to share?
Yeah. I'm going to be slightly controversial here, and at the same time very transparent. We actually say no to certain partnerships exactly for the reasons you mentioned, because we only have so many resources, and we also have a business to run. So we try and be very selective. And I would like to take it back to the point of the absolutely crucial role of governments. So we have ended up working in partnerships on a more micro level. So we choose them very carefully, and then we try and really tie them up very strongly with both government and the relevant civil society organizations. So we have a global MOU with UNICEF, with everything to do with child rights and child online protection. But we obviously can't execute that just with UNICEF. We then make sure that the governments buy into it. And I think the reason that we need the governments, because like someone mentioned, most governments have national broadband plans. So all of these ideas really should fit into that. So I think what we of course don't want to stifle competition and innovation, and we always want to be open-minded, always look at ideas. But I think we also, perhaps, it's a little bit of a call to civil society, to international organizations, please take a step back and maybe do a bit of a cull and look at what is it the governments in each country want and need, and who fits into those programs. Because they ultimately are the owners of the infrastructure in their countries. We operate on licenses that they let us use. So at the end of the day, between us and the governments, it's very clear which roles we can play there. But there's too much, input from the outside sometimes to ideas and that are not necessarily being channeled. And I'm not saying that the governments have the capacity on their own necessarily to decide on that. They need the help from civil society and the institutions. But I think, we probably should all take a step back and take stock and say, okay, what are the national broadband plans? How do the women fit in those? Which are the departments that actually need support, and what kind of support do they need? And then what are the operators' role in terms of helping execute some of that? Because otherwise, we said, we'll just continue to have a barrage of ideas, and we're talking about wanting to partner, but actually ending up duplicating more than streamlining.
Thank you. So selective partnerships, doing, as it's always said, less but better. Cool.
If I could just jump in again, and Rachel's point about being perhaps selective, I think the role of the government is critical. If the government doesn't view this as a priority, it's going to be very difficult to do a project or have a partnership in that specific country. And we have been analyzing national broadband plans. Regrettably, most of them don't have specific references to closing the digital gender gap, so we try to urge governments to put that in there. And then, as I mentioned in the beginning, to be appropriating the necessary budget to actually make sure that it happens and it gets implemented.
And I think just piggybacking on that real quick, is also being very specific and to an extent even surgical on what kind of issue we're tackling. So I'll give the example of how we work on driving down the cost of broadband through the Alliance for Affordable Internet, that most of the people represented here are also we are all partners of each other's partnerships. But it's very specific to the issue of driving down the cost of broadband. And that one necessitates governments to come to the table. So their broadband plans are brought to the table. Issues to do with infrastructure sharing are brought to the table. It has a global level component. It has a local level component where governments actually invite the coalition and they actually subscribe to working with private sector and civil society in country. What I will tell you for free, it is not easy to get all those people in the room. It is long term. So support mechanisms for that definitely need to assess that. And I think down the line, what we're starting to see with this discussions is what is a successful partnership look like, and what is a framework for that? And maybe one of these days at the next IGF will have a framework.
Thank you. A popular question. Yes.
Yeah, I really love them. I'm Zara from Malaysia, and I'm with the government.
No, the top. Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry about that. Maybe I'm the only one from the government here.
Oh, yay.
But I just would like to share with you that we are not that bad. In Malaysia, we are trying our very best, actually. And when you talk about partnership, I really love it because that is the issue that we are having at the moment. You know, in Malaysia, we use what we call it the multiple helix, or you call it National Blue Ocean Strategy. So we are talking about competition, we are talking about competitiveness. Here, there is not too much competition, okay? Where government actually is leading, and I'm from the communications and multimedia sector. So I can say that, and I would like to reassure that actually we can do that if we want to do it. Okay, what we did was that we will ask the telcos, okay, this is the partnership, we call it PPP, and then, okay, private and public, we work together, where the telcos are going to take the infrastructure part. Of course, we provide the license, and they do it for us. We call it digitize, humanize. The digitizing part will be taken by the telcos, and the humanizing part, the one that you're talking about, the software, that is the training, providing training, empower women, and to make sure that they are there to use the infrastructure that will be provided by the telcos. So it is really surprising when I got to know, and we went down to the most remote areas in Malaysia. We bring connectivity to them. We provide training for them. And at the end of the day, I can see women are everywhere. And they are really, I can say that we unlock and unleash their potential, particularly in entrepreneurship. They are so good at that. And I would love to recommend that if we can do that, that will be quite good. Yeah? Telcos and the government, that I would like to say again, government really must play its role and play it well. Thank you very much.
And thank you. It's fantastic to have somebody here to represent all governments as well as just Malaysia. I'm really sorry, but we have time for one very, very, very quick question, if it's a quick question.
Thank you very much. I'm from Cuba. I'm also from the government. I think that, very briefly, is first the legal obligation of states on signing and ratifying the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, where Cuba was the first government to sign and the second to ratify. First, the legal obligation for the rights of women and not to be discriminated. Second is to implement that obligation through the basic education, literacy programs, access to training in the early ages of girls specifically. Then we go to the ages of empowerment, and the panelists, all of the panelists have referred to empowerment, but not only economic empowerment, but political empowerment too, although this concept is not used normally. So the idea is that not only to get access to internet, but access to the content, access to the training, access to all of the levels of resources for women really to become a decision-making actor in the space, in the economy, in the markets. So that's our vision. So now at the level of Cuba, there is a big process of informatization of society, although we are maybe lacking of higher access to internet, but we are evolving very fast in the current years because there is a national strategy by the government where there is a focus on women, taking into account our commitments from the legal point of view, but through the area of informatization, like it's a new way of doing it. So we really would like to thank all of the panelists, and we really fully support that the gender must be in the center of all of the broadband plan of actions and strategies by governments. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that comment. It's great to know, fantastic to know that Cuba is committed to this issue, and you've obviously got plans in place. I'm sorry, we've run out of time for any other questions, but what I am going to do before I wrap up is I'm just going to ask the panel all very briefly. This is, and I think we knew this before we came in the room, a very complex issue, the reasons why we have a digital gender gap, why there are less women online than men. It's very complex, and there are a lot of interlocking barriers and reasons why women aren't coming online. And because it is complex, there's going to be no silver bullet. There's going to be no one thing that we can do that will solve it. But I'm going to ask our panel if you can just say one by one if there's something we should be focusing on moving forward and looking to the future, what would it be? So if Rachel, if you could start, where would you focus?
Well, some of the points I've made, everyone contributing their expertise, streamlined focus efforts where every party really has to sit at the table and decide jointly where should the energy be spent rather than everyone doing their own projects.
I would like to focus on, I think civil society having a lot more to do with infrastructure and regulation in the sense of providing other models for local access and community networks. I really feel that this is an area that needs to be looked at seriously as a way to address the gap around access, and it is quite powerful if our community networks and our local access initiatives are definitely gender responsive. And part of that is regulation in relation, for example, to spectrum. So it's not only telcos. I would to look at telcos as providers, but also look at community as providers. Because if you have that, I think you then are closer to some of the local issues that are really quite intractable. So I do think something much more, really look at other models aside from what we have now.
Thank you. We encapsulate this issue with an acronym that is REACT, a focus on rights, education, affordable access, relevant content, and clear government targets. The problem with that question and the solution to it is that it's not an either or, it's who takes which chunk and runs with it, and each person, government, private sector, civil society, in each of those elements that we've discussed today has a role to play. We will not start with one and finish with the other. They all have to be in lockstep, but I think it's happening, and over time I think it's not going to happen overnight, but we have to continue working that way and focus on closing that gap that way.
Maybe picking up on one of Rachel's points before, when we think about the future, I think the one key thing for me is focusing on youth and the future leaders. So it's about engaging, empowering, and educating young girls. I think we should really be focusing there. And the other thing I also wanted to mention is the importance of engaging male champions. And again, Ursula, this one's for you, because Australia has this Male Champions for Change that's been quite effective, and we really need to bring more men into this discussion. Thank you.
So I think I'm last, and everybody have said what I completely agree with. I think it's important that we understand what the puzzle is, and that each organization take a piece of the puzzle, either together or individually. But if I were to give one action, I think it's to really understand the puzzle. What are the missing pieces in it? And where do we need to collect more data? What are the good practices that are already out there? And instead of reinventing the wheel, how do we capitalize on those, help scale them and duplicate them in other cultural settings, instead of trying to start from scratch? And there's a lot of organization trying to start from scratch over and over. So I think that really the partnership approach is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those some really insightful final comments there, and said it's not a silver bullet, and I think you'd all agree with it because you're looking at some quite holistic approaches. I'm going to attempt to try and sum up some of the themes that I've heard today. This is always the tricky bit, and I hope everybody will have taken something out of it, but I've certainly heard a lot about raising awareness of the issue, about understanding the problem, what you were just saying there, Anna, about understanding the different pieces of the puzzle, building our knowledge, sharing data, and measuring the impact of initiatives. So when we're talking about research, it's not just about understanding the problem, but understanding what's happening with the solution. I've certainly heard a lot about the need that we need to tackle perceptions of what the internet is and show the benefits of it. That we need commitment from all stakeholders, whether it's from local to global and across region, but also across different types of women, whether they're disabled women, but also from young girls to older women, so that we are tackling the issue in the long term. So educating from the outset, I think, was the comment. Other things, we've talked a lot about partnership and the need for partnership, for collaboration, not to compete against each other, but to be focused, to select our partnerships, and to make sure that we're working to all go in the same direction. And I think the other theme that I've heard a lot of talk about is these concerns with safety online, with cyber harassment and cyberbullying, and this is something that I think is, I have seen from our research, not so much always a barrier to getting online, but once people are online, about keeping people online and keeping people active online, because before they go online, they're not as aware of it. And I think it's something that when we're looking at the usage part and not just the access part, that we're really going to have to understand and tackle. So this leads me just to say thank you very much to everyone who's come to listen to this session about digital inclusion. It's fantastic to see so many people, and as Doreen said, to see so many men in the audience as well as women, and to know that people care, and to say thank you very, very much to our panel. You're all people who have extremely busy jobs, and really appreciate the time you've taken out to join us and talk to it. So thank you very much. Thank you.